Is our justice system equipped to handle the likes of Donald Trump? Former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias. Let's get started. Joyce Vance, welcome to Defending Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
So, Joyce, I've wanted to talk to you for some time now because you have a unique background. You are not just a lawyer, but you are a former federal prosecutor, and you are also a law professor at the University of Alabama. You worked as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama during the Obama administration. And so, you have the virtue of having practiced law, of having been in an oversight position as the U.S. Attorney, and now teaching law students. And so from all of those vantage points, if you can meld them all, which I'm sure they are in your head, what do you make of the judicial system's handling of Donald Trump? He's been indicted in 4 places. What do you make of how the judicial system is held up?
So this is such a great question. It's something we should talk about more. And the perspective that I really like for this, Mark, is, because I was both a line prosecutor for many, many years and then became the U.S. Attorney, as you mentioned, with sort of supervisory oversight over the indictment of cases and strategic thinking about how to prosecute them, but also how we interacted with our court system. I've really watched the prosecutions of Trump with great interest, both as a citizen who's interested in accountability, but also as a professional who's handled cases, certainly not like this one. There's nothing like it, but public corruption cases with a lot of interesting quirks. And I've thought a lot about, it seems to me the bottom line is there something in our system that means it can't handle a Donald Trump, right? He engages in delay. He seems to skate out from under sorts of problems and challenges no other person could avoid. And I think that causes a lot of people to question the system. My response is the system is up to handling Donald Trump. Prosecutors are up to handling Donald Trump, but it takes time. And one of the problems we face is that democracy, needs to get on the move with it. We are close to the end. And so I think, and I don't mean to the end of democracy, but close to the election when people should have access to information. But what happened in Manhattan shows us a case can be avoided, or a case can be indicted. Prosecutors can avoid caving into external pressure. All the people who said that the New York case wasn't meritorious or they didn't have the evidence, they just kept their heads down and kept doing their job. The court system dealt with a Donald Trump. Far too many people have been way too deferential to Donald Trump. Courts don't need to do that. He can be treated like any other litigant. And ultimately, the jury did its job.
Yeah. So how much of the problem or perceived problem is that Donald Trump was treated with deference in one court or another? And I'm going to ask you some specific questions about some of the particular judges and court and cases. But how much of it is that he was treated with too much deference, and how much of it is that we do have a notion in the United States that we want to bend over backwards, particularly in criminal cases, to make sure that criminal defendants receive every protection, right? It is not just that there is a requirement of an indictment, that there is pretrial discovery, that there is presumption of innocence, that there's a requirement of unanimity. But it is a general sense that you want to make sure that defendants get a fair trial, both from a constitutional standpoint, but also from a public confidence standpoint. And I wonder, if it is that the system has failed, which frankly I have said, and others have said, or whether it's actually, in some ways, the system working, that it is actually supposed to be flexing itself for defendants who need and pose the hard cases. And I wonder, how do you balance those two things, right? Both wanting results and trials to move along, but on the other hand, being we do want criminal defendants to get a fair trial.
Yeah, it's tough, right? It is a balancing act. I reject this notion, and I hope that people aren't saying this seriously, lock him up as applied to Donald Trump. Well, no. Every criminal defendant is entitled to all of the protections that the Constitution provides, including Donald Trump. So there's that part of the balance. And then there's this notion of protecting political leaders from the criminal justice system being weaponized, something Republicans are throwing around these days without much basis for it. But we don't want to be that banana republic where the criminal justice system becomes a tool of the White House or a tool of political people. That, I think, is why prosecutors were right to go slow early on. They were breaking fresh ground. They wanted to ensure that before they investigated a candidate, then a sitting president, that they crossed every I and dotted every T. And that was, frankly, the right decision. But on the other side of the equation is the way that Donald Trump uses the system against itself. And once it becomes clear that he's abusing the system for delay, to avoid facing courts, then I think the judges and prosecutors have to kick in and do, frankly, what they did in Manhattan. Hold that defendant's feet to the fire, say, as Jack Smith has said in the Washington, D.C. prosecution, the public has a speedy trial right too, and try to get the equation so that everyone's rights, both the defendants and the public's, are respected.
Yeah, so the one case that seems to me unlike the others is the one in Florida, and it's unusual for a few respects. The first is that I have to say, and I do not practice in this area of the law, but it seemed to me at least like a pretty clear case that maybe would be a little complicated by some the fact that it had national security documents at stake, but it seemed relatively straightforward, and yet that case seems to not be going very fast.
The easiest case that you do as a federal prosecutor is something that we call felon in possession. The charge, it's 18 U.S. Code 922G, and it says this person, having been previously convicted of a felony, was found in possession of a firearm. You got to prove the prior conviction, the possession of the firearm, and that the gun traveled in interstate commerce, and bam, you're done. Well, this case, the classified documents case in Florida, isn't all that much different. It's saying that Donald Trump retained those documents after he exited the White House. And that is a pretty straightforward case. And you know what makes it even easier is when you have a defendant who obstructs the investigation into his conduct, and there's videotape of his designees moving boxes containing materials he's illegally in possession of so that they're out of reach of his own lawyers and investigators from DOJ. It's when someone lies for a period of months about retaining those documents and tells conflicting stories. This is not a tough case. There are some difficulties that need to be worked through pre-trial, including how classified material is handling. But I think the point that you're working up to is that the judge may have slow-walked this one just a little bit and overcomplicated it.
Yeah, speaking of judges slow-walking things, I, for the life of me, can't understand what the Supreme Court is up to in this immunity case. I mean, I don't think in the end of the day there's going to be 5 votes to say that a president can engage in a coup or assassinate their opponents. So I don't think the worst is going to come to pass. There may be some votes on the Supreme Court for something that broad, but I don't think that's where the court's going to land. But we do have a circumstance in which the court took what was a pretty well thought out DC Circuit opinion. There was no obvious circuit split because this really has not come up elsewhere, which is one of the reasons why the Supreme Court might have taken the case to begin with. It's not clear to me why the Supreme Court had to take the case. Let's just be clear, right? The Supreme Court has a discretionary docket. It could have simply said, we're going to leave the case where it is and let things move forward. They didn't do that. They did take the case, and now they have taken an extremely long time to consider this and effectively blocked, from a timing standpoint, made it, if not entirely blocked, made it almost impossible for a case to go to trial in the Washington, D. case before the November election. What do you make of the Supreme Court's decision to take the case and sort of how the arguments and everything have played out so far?
Yeah, I'm going to hedge my bets here because I hate trying to crystal ball what
Right.
the Supreme Court will do these days. I think endgame, we're looking at one of two things. Either Chief Justice Roberts is masterfully trying to rope everybody into a very narrow 9-0 decision that everybody can live with, or alternatively, people are writing dissents and concurrences and trying to get their brethren and sistren to join in, and it's a last day of term mess. But it's a very interesting question why the court has handled it so slowly, because there is a clear path forward in this case. And it's to say, yes, there's a limited scope of immunity for presidential conduct. For instance, some of the strikes that were conducted when President Obama was in office based on best information they had and advice of all of his experts. The life of an American citizen was taken. That's something that technically is a crime. We want presidents to have immunity in that sort of a wartime setting. But you know what? This case, Donald Trump and the coup, that's not it. We don't have to decide what the full scope of presidential immunity is to say, this ain't it. Go ahead, Judge Chutkan, get on with your work. And I'm frankly concerned that we don't have a court that's able in a moment like this of really, national disruption, capable of doing that and moving the case along.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, as a law professor, so every day you see students in, their best and their worst. They're learning the trade of being a lawyer. They're also learning how to think like a lawyer, but they're also observing what's happening in the judicial system in a way that, you don't when you're not in law school. I was in law school between the Bork hearings and Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision. Which
You're
was
making me feel really old right now. Thank you for that.
And these things are naturally discussed. I'm curious, what do law students today, what are the lessons that they walk away with, or what do you try to impart with them today about how to make sense of the profession they're entering into?
Yeah, I love my students so much. I mean, it is like really a gift from God to get to teach. They're smart. They're motivated, they're interested in this stuff, they're engaged on democracy issues, and every day they give me hope for the future. And I think what I have to do, the best thing that I can do is tell them, you guys have access to Twitter. You can figure out pretty quickly what my political views are. That's not what we do in law school. Our job here is to look at issues from all sides, to evaluate the facts, to evaluate the law, to think about how they work together. And so in the spring, I teach a seminar on democratic institutions that attracts as many conservative kids as it does more progressive kids. And this year, I don't think they would mind me sharing. We had this really, I just thought it was an emotional moment where one of the students was saying, I'm a conservative. I believe in Republican policy, but I am embarrassed by what I'm seeing. And I think it's good for us to be able to acknowledge that there's a difference between party and policy and country and democracy. That's the sort of moment we live in. But what I want my students to do is think for themselves. I don't want them to accept what anybody's saying at face value, me or anyone else. I want us to read lots of different sorts of primary documents, starting, frankly, with the founding fathers and the Constitution and moving forward. It's possible that we read a little bit of Marc Elias when we get to voting rights and some of the cases that you've been involved in. And what I really want them to do is think about this great gift of democracy that we all share and what we need to do to make sure it continues.
We'll be right back with more of my discussion with Joyce Vance. But in the meantime, I hope you take a moment to become either a free subscriber or a paid member to Democracy Docket. The links are in the show notes below. So the other thing that I feel like you are uniquely situated to comment on is, Alabama is a very important state when it comes to the issues of voting and the Voting Rights Act, the history of the Voting Rights Act, and also the more recent history of some of the court cases that involve voting. I mean, Shelby County came out of Alabama. That was the case that struck down the coverage formula of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, effectively gutting the pre-clearance regime. More recently, Allen v. Milligan, which my law firm handled. My partner, Albacana, argued in the Supreme Court, which was a very important gerrymandering case. Section 2 Voting Rights Act case came out of Alabama. I'm curious what you think of when you see these cases coming out of the state in which you live. Like, how do you process it in a way that's probably different than those of us, who I grew up in New York, I live in Washington, D.C. To me, these are more abstractions. I mean, I care deeply about the issues, but I'm just wondering how it informs your work, either when you were a U.S. attorney or now as a law professor, or just your thoughts on democracy issues.
Yeah, so I'm about to undo years of therapy that let me sleep at night. So, my father-in-law, who was a federal judge in Alabama, as a lawyer, he actually worked on Reynolds versus Sims, the one
Wow.
man, one vote case. Um, it's fair to say that my family has sort of a tradition and history of voting rights work in Alabama, although I'm not a native. I'm married in. Shelby County happened under my predecessor as U.S. Attorney during the Bush administration. Alabama brought that case in front of a 3-judge panel in the District of Columbia rather than submitting to the Attorney General for preclearance, which is perhaps the more normal route. So we didn't participate in preparing the record for that case. By the time, it was argued, the president was Barack Obama. I think Don Verrilli was the Solicitor General. My
Yeah.
memory is getting
Yes.
bad now. But I remember being asked to look at the record and just thinking, wow, we're in trouble. There are things that should be in this record that aren't in this record. Because my understanding is based on, as you say, living here and seeing the sort of day in and day out voter suppression that takes place here. There's this perennial example, right? In Black communities, mailers go out, postcards, robocalls, and they say, Republicans vote on Tuesday, the day of the election. And Democrats, if you're going to vote Democratic, your day to vote is Thursday. That one's been going on forever. My husband, we elect our judges in Alabama. My husband ran for Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court against Roy Moore before
Wow.
Roy Moore's other interests were outed. I spent a lot of time reminding my husband that he actually lost to Roy Moore. But in the closing days of that election, there were mailers of Bob sort of done as a marionette puppet with Barack Obama and other familiar, recognizable Black faces, doing the puppet strings as though to suggest. And so there are these efforts, I think, to both suppress people from voting, to provide disinformation, misinformation, to influence other people from voting down here in a persistent, sustained way. Every election, before I was the U.S. Attorney even, I would get phone calls, from Republicans complaining about voter fraud. We would dutifully and very seriously conduct those investigations. My Bush predecessor looked vigorously for 8 years for a voter fraud case to prosecute and could not find one. And yet, the concern down here is voter fraud, not voter suppression, which just happens every day. And I'll stop there because otherwise I'll just end up ranting about it.
No, I think it's really interesting. And I think it would be helpful for people who are not from Alabama for you to just tell us a little bit about Shelby County, the place.
Yeah. Shelby County is the county south of Jefferson County, where Birmingham is. The first time I went to Shelby County as a sitting U.S. attorney to speak to a large group of businessmen down there, I laughed and thanked them for letting me cross the border from Jefferson County, majority Democratic, to Shelby County, strongly majority Republican. And I have never forgotten the first question I was asked after I got done talking. It was as though I was part of the boys club and in on the joke. And the gentleman who asked me the question said, "Now I know it must be horrible for you, honey, working for Obama and Holder and them, but," and before he could get his question out, I said, let me stop you right there. Eric Holder is the best boss that I have ever worked for, and I don't appreciate the insinuation. And I never talk like that. I'm usually pretty nice to people, but it just got me wrong. And I ended up explaining everything that I liked about Holder and how when I'd asked him what my marching orders as a U.S. attorney were, he said, "Just do the right thing." And that was what I tried to do every day and sort of to live up to every day. They were very taken aback that I would defend the political leadership of the Justice Department in that moment in time. And that to me, Shelby County, very conservative. I don't want to say poorly educated because that's not the case. These are smart people who think for themselves and do what they believe is the right thing. But the information that filters down to them is not always accurate. I mean, we're all seeing what's going on this week on the Sinclair TV stations. We know what happens on Fox News and other media. And I worry a lot about media dissemination of information.
So I want to ask you about Allen v. Milligan, the second case I mentioned, which is the case that challenged the congressional map in in Alabama. To give a very brief history, Alabama's maps had been drawn to have one majority black opportunity district. A lawsuit was filed, actually, two lawsuits were filed that sort of traveled in parallel with one another, that essentially said there should be a second majority black or a second black opportunity district under the Voting Rights Act. That claim succeeded before a three-judge panel, three-judge district court panel, which was comprised of two appointees of President Trump. So it was not a easy panel to prove a Voting Rights Act claim before, but they found that there was a Voting Rights Act claim. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. People thought the U.S. Supreme Court might use it as an opportunity to overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. They didn't. They affirmed. And this is the part I want to ask you about. So then it goes back to Alabama, and Alabama is given the opportunity to draw a new map. And instead of drawing essentially a new compliant map, they basically, throw a tantrum.
They just said, we don't care about the Supreme Court. We're going to draw our own map. It was stunning.
Yeah. So I'm curious. That's certainly how it looked like, from the outside. And I'm curious about two things. The first is, Chief Justice Roberts said in Shelby County that essentially words to the effect of times have changed. And it's certainly watching the state of Alabama's governor tell the Supreme Court to go screw itself certainly didn't seem like times had changed in Alabama. And number two, politically, why did they think it was better to give themselves no opportunity to influence the map and have a court draw it?
This is, I think about this as the Alabamization of America. People were so surprised and taken aback by what Donald Trump did after he became president. We had already watched it happen down here 5-6 years ahead of that curve. Nothing was surprising from immigration onward. And least of all when it came to voting rights. Mark, I know you know the original maps better than I do. I remember I would always look at the maps and I would think there's no way that anyone could look at this map and not think it's gerrymandered, because it's like this blob of a body with a hand that reaches into majority black Birmingham and another hand that reaches into majority black Montgomery, these, two stretched out hands that grab as much of the black population as they can, just sort of forcing it all into that one district and then spreading out what's left among Alabama's other congressional districts. How the legislature could look at that and feel good about themselves and what they were doing is a mystery to me. And so I have always concluded that there was an intent to discriminate against black voters. I'm surprised, by the way, that we never heard the justification that succeeded in South Carolina. Oh, this was never about race, it was about politics. But the reality is, whatever the Supreme Court thinks, politics do become a marker for race, and race does become a marker for politics down here. This level of hubris that the Alabama legislature engaged in, I think tells us a lot about how comfortable they are in this racism and in this level of gerrymandering. The reality is Alabama's not as one party as people want folks to think it is. There are a large number of Democrats in this state, some moderate, some progressive, but the problem is we are spread across the state in ways that means we can't really elect candidates of choice very often when we're looking at districts. We don't do great in statewide races either, so that cuts a little bit against my argument. But you can see how so much of the damage that's done to voters, this notion that you can't win, becomes the reality that you can't win until people just don't really bother to exercise their vote. And something that Angus King, the senator in Maine, said to me when I was working on a project I was doing some research for, has really stuck with me. He talked about how he had this bet with the then governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura, about which state would have higher voter turnout, because he just wanted people to vote. He didn't care who they worked for. And someone had pointed out to him, Governor, if you do this, people that don't vote for, our side might vote. And he said, that just wasn't my goal. I wanted everybody to vote. that is not the Alabama way. And I think that that's the bottom line in cases like Milligan, your case, and something that people should be concerned about going forward. Politicians shouldn't be selecting their voters. We should be selecting our elected officials. And the system here is deeply broken.
So speaking of broken systems, the Republican Party is on the precipice of renominating a convicted felon, someone who has spent the last several years running essentially a grievance campaign based on the outcome of the 2020 election, who regularly spreads conspiracy theories and who opposes virtually all kinds of voting that he thinks might possibly enfranchise people who don't vote for him. He has recently said that he believes he didn't just win the 6 states he contested last time in the post-election last time, which were Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, but that he also believes he won Minnesota, which he lost by 7 percentage points. He has said that he believes he will win New York and New Jersey, in addition to Minnesota and Virginia. So he is in some ways, Donald Trump is in some ways getting worse, not better, right? If you took the rhetoric of 2016 and you matched it up to the rhetoric of 2020 and you match it up to the rhetoric today, it is much worse, as is the Republican Party as a whole. So what do you tell people who watch this and see this and think, well, Joyce, why do I believe the courts or the law is going to be any check on this guy?
The biggest check on Donald Trump has been us, the voters. And I continue to believe that that's the biggest check on Donald Trump. It's really hard to contest an election when the numbers are overwhelming. And I think the duty that's incumbent upon us as citizens is to turn out in record numbers to vote. I'm seeing all these polls that say that, there's like a 78% chance that Donald Trump wins. That's something that folks were touting this afternoon. I have trouble believing that, just from the conversations that I hear in my own community with evangelical women who will not go and vote for Donald Trump, and many of whom didn't the last time, with people who are moderate conservatives who will not vote for Donald Trump, with people who normally wouldn't go out and vote, normally aren't that interested, who are going to go out and vote for Joe Biden because they're sort of worried about not having contraception, their kids coming of age and not having access to these sort of basic and fundamental rights. And so I think that's the answer here. I do have confidence in the courts, by the way, but I have more confidence in voters. And I think we need to turn out in record numbers and vote for democracy.
So my last question for you is, you have a great newsletter, Civil Discourse. I recommend everyone read it and subscribe to it. The link is in the show notes below. But one of the things that you've addressed, that is the question I get the most often. I suspect it is among the questions you get the most often, although you probably get a lot more questions about why isn't Donald Trump in jail. But the biggest question I get is, what can people do? Like, it is easy for someone like you. You have a huge megaphone. You're on TV. You are on podcasts. You teach law students. You're a national figure. But I'm sure you run into people who are like, what do I do? What does the individual do who, other than voting, which is obviously very important. And I always tell people the single most important thing you can do is register and to vote. But like, if someone is just like, what do I do to help protect democracy? Whether it's in Alabama or it's in Missoula or it's in, New York City, like, what can people do? Because there's just such a sense of hopelessness or helplessness out there.
Yeah, I think this is the most important question, right? What can each of us do? I mean, situations are different, locations are different. And so I had one of these conversations with one of my neighbors 4 or 5 years ago, and she really wanted to do something. And I said, well, I know that they need more poll workers at our polling place, and it's hard to get poll workers. She volunteered as a poll worker. She has found it to be so satisfying. She's pulled some of our other neighbors in. I think doing things like that are important. And so here's my view on that. I'm sort of the kind of person, I need an invitation. I'm not just going to show up at a big meeting. I feel a little bit awkward doing that. But folks can go online. One of the most important sustained efforts that's happening right now is folks writing postcards to voters in close toss-up states, in close toss-up races. And at first I thought, this can't really work, right? Writing postcards to people, except that they've now done some study verification that shows that potential voters who receive a handwritten, postcard from somebody who says, hey, I'm Joyce in Alabama, and I sure hope you're going to turn out and vote. This is an important election. Your right to vote matters. And, draws a couple of little cute faces on it and pops it in the mail. That really works. And that's something that you can sign up to do online. Like you say, making sure you're registered to vote. And by the way, the Supreme Court, has authorized quote unquote pruning of voter rolls, which means you might find yourself moved to inactive status without realizing it. That means you have to jump through some hoops to get your vote counted. Well, everybody can go online. I think you can't be pruned more than 90 days in advance of the next election. So around day 89 or later, jump on to one of the websites that lets you check your voting status and make sure that you're registered, and take a screenshot of that so that if there's any problem when you show up at the polls, you're okay. In some states, there are groups that help people get rides to the polls. In other states and other locations, there are actually engaged communities that speak with candidates. They still hold debates. I mean, that might seem a little bit quaint at this point, but that does still happen. And so we can show up for that. We can get educated. But I think the most important thing is for each of us to commit to finding a way to be involved, whatever the right way is for our personal circumstances and where we are.
Yeah, and I cannot emphasize enough, that the personal touch is still more important to people than anything else. So it is one thing for someone to watch a television ad. They know it's a television ad. They know that it was created to influence them. It's another thing for them to get, like you said, a postcard in the mail, a handwritten postcard from someone, or a knock on the door, someone who takes the time to go to their door. But, each of us has I sometimes say each of us has a public square. Some people's public square, your public square is enormous. You are on, two world-renowned or nationally recognized podcasts that reach undoubtedly hundreds of thousands or millions of people. You're an MSNBC contributor. You have all of these forums that are part of your public square. But that shouldn't discourage people who have a public square that may be their Facebook group or their Bible study group or their knitting club or their bowling club. Like, these are all their public square. And reaching out to people in your social circles will do a really big lift in helping make sure we get everyone to vote and we protect democracy.
So, Mark, I think that's right. This notion of the personal touch in voting and in community, we can't overstate it. People are way more interested in hearing what their neighbors think than a talking head on TV like me. I have these conversations in supermarkets. I am a member of a knitting club. We talk about politics in knitting group. Knitters can change the world. And I firmly believe that there are a lot of groups like that. It's real easy not to vote, by the way. What we need to do is make sure our friends, our neighbors, our families, everybody around us, that they are registered and that they have a way to go out and vote.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not sure it will be a family party. It may be at my household, it may be a nerve-wracking clench our jaws and hope day, but we will certainly be voting in my household, as I know yours, and I hope everyone out there listening makes sure it takes the good advice that Joyce has given us. Again, if you are not subscribed to her newsletter, please do so. It is amazing. Also, we'll put links to the podcasts I mentioned, which I highly recommend as well. Joyce Vance, thank you for joining us today, and good luck with everything you are doing. You are really an inspiration for all of us.
Well, it's an honor to be with you. I am such a huge fan of your work.
Thanks for watching Defending Democracy. Make sure you're subscribed to our daily and weekly newsletters to stay up to date on the latest voting rights and democracy news.